before we start talking about how to calculate the location of a midpoint in coordinate geometry, let's remind ourselves what a midpoint actually is. And it's the point on a segment which divides the segment into two congruent parts, or two congruent smaller segments. So let's see an example of that. Here I have segment AB, which has coordinates 4, 1, and 6, 9. And on this segment, I'm going to use some computer software to construct the midpoint. I'll call this point M for midpoint. And to confirm that it actually is the midpoint, I'm going to measure the two segments that it divides my segment AB into. So notice that these two segment lengths, AM and MB, are congruent, which means that M is the midpoint. Now, to notice what the coordinates of this midpoint are, we could read them off, and it turns out that it is 5, 5. Now, to see how those coordinates relate to the values of A and B, you may notice that this value 5, 5 actually occurs not just in the middle of the segment AB, but occurs in the middle of their X values and in the middle of their Y values. So the midpoint, the coordinates of the midpoint, are the average of the coordinates of the endpoints of the segment. What does that mean? Well, in the terms of a formula, given 2 points, the equation of the midpoint is given by this midpoint formula. The coordinates, the X coordinate of the midpoint is the average of the X coordinates of my endpoints of the segment, and the Y coordinate of the midpoint is the average of the Y coordinates of the endpoints of the segment. So in the context of my example, to find the coordinates of the midpoint, M, I could take the average of the X values of the coordinates I have, so that'll be 4 from point A plus 6 from point B, and divide by 2. It's an average, the sum of two numbers divided by 2. And for the Y coordinate, it'd be the Y coordinate from point A, which is 1, plus the Y coordinate from point B, which is 9, divided by 2. And when I simplify that out, I get the coordinates of my midpoint to be 4 plus 6, or 10, over 2, and 1 plus 9, which is 10, divided by 2, so that my midpoint is just 10 divided by 2, which is 5, and 5. Okay, which is what I got via my construction. So we can use this midpoint formula anytime I want the coordinates of the midpoint of a segment. Let's look at these examples. Find the coordinates of the midpoint of the segments that joins the given points. So recall that the midpoint is the average of the X values for its X coordinate and the average of the Y values for the Y coordinate. And I'll just keep that over to the side for reference. So when I do this question, my midpoint will be the average of the X values, which is -5 plus 4 divided by 2, and then 2 plus -2 over 2, which is equivalent to -5 plus 4 is -1 over 2, and 2 minus 2 is 0, and 0 divided by 2 is just 0. So the coordinates of my midpoint are -1/2, 0, and that's where they will occur for this segment. Scrolling down to my other example, if I use this same midpoint formula, I'll have the average of my X, which is 3 plus -5, or I could just write that as -5, over 2, and 0 plus 5 over 2, which simplifies to -2 over 2, and 5 over 2, or more simply, -1 and 5/2. So there's the coordinates of my midpoint for this segment. We can also look at this graphically. So for this one, on the set of axes, I'm going to plot these 2 points and then find and plot the midpoint. So first I'll plot point E. Now on this, my scale is 1 box is equivalent to 1 unit, so I'll go over 1 up 2 and plot E. and then I'll go over 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and up 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and plot F. I'll connect those 2 points with a segment, so that now I have segment EF. And I'm going to try to plot the midpoint. Well, if I look at this graphically, I can see sort of where the midpoint will end up. If I look at where the middle of the segment is, my guess would be the midpoint should end up here at 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So my guess is that the midpoint should end here at 3, 4, looking at this graphically. So let's confirm that by using the midpoint formula, which is the average of the x values for the x coordinate and the average of the y values for the y coordinate. So my midpoint should be 1 plus 5 over 2 for my x values, and 2 plus 6 over 2 for my y values, which gives me 6 halves and 8 halves, which reduces to 3 and 4. So the midpoint formula confirms what I was able to identify graphically. So that's actually 2 ways you can find the midpoint. You can find it by actually reading off the graph or by using the midpoint formula. Now sometimes you'll be given the midpoint and asked to find the other coordinate of the endpoint of the segment. So in a situation like this, where I'm trying to find the coordinates of B, I'm going to call point B x, y. I'm going to find both the x and the y values. Well, recall that the midpoint is the average of the x coordinates of the 2 points, so that's going to be x plus 4 over 2 in this case, because A and B are the endpoints of my segment, and the average of the y values would be y plus 6 over 2. And since I'm given the midpoint in this example, this value will be equivalent to 3, 0. Well, the only way this is going to be equal is if x plus 4 over 2 equals the x coordinate of the midpoint, -3, and y plus 6 over 2 equals the y coordinate of the midpoint, which is 0. So now, to find the coordinates of x and y, I simply have to solve these 2 equations. To do that, I'll multiply both sides by 2 in my first equation. These 2's will cancel, and I'm left with x plus 4 is equal to -6, and then I'll subtract 4 from both sides. So I get that the x coordinate must be -10. Then I'll do the same thing with b, multiply both sides by 2. Here my 2's will cancel, and I get x plus 6 equals 0 times 2, which is 0. And when I subtract 6 from both sides, I'll end up with y is equal to -6. So now I have my coordinates for point B are x, which we turned out was -10, and y, which turned out was -6. There are several other questions in your note sheet, the solutions to which can be found on the portal. So check those over, and we'll go over them tomorrow.